So it would appear that my face has been squished. I got a new laptop, and this is how the camera looks. Oh well. So I wanted to tell you all a little bit about my meeting of John Searle last night. He came to give a lecture at my school at the Consciousness Forum, and he lectured on consciousness. And I got to ask him a few questions. I wasn't entirely satisfied with his answers, but I wasn't expecting to be. But I wanted to share the two questions that I asked him to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and where he's coming from as a longtime philosopher of consciousness who um, he really believes that the neuroscientists probably have the right paradigm, that you've got to look inside the skull for the mechanism, the causal mechanism responsible for causing consciousness. So for him, it's a skull-bound activity of electrochemical of an electrochemical nature. So here is my first question.
So I'm with you in your critique of computationalism and your critique of behaviorism, and I'm with you in your desire to move to biology as the context within which the research of consciousness should be undertaken. But the thing about organisms is they live in environments, right? Yeah. And it seems to me that this focus on looking inside the skull for the cause of consciousness is just a subtler form of behaviorism. We're looking at the behavior of neurons now, and looking for mechanisms in terms of how they interact to explain consciousness rather than the behavior of our bodies. But could it be that there are other paradigms you haven't mentioned, like enactivism, the embodied paradigms, where consciousness is more something that emerges in the context of the interactions of people in society, and a mother with her child, and it emerges between people and in the world, not just in the skull.
Okay, well, as you know, you raise a whole lot more questions than we can really settle here, but let me just make a few comments. One is, it isn't just the input-output function of the neuron, but rather the causal mechanisms by which masses of neurons cause subjectivity. That's what we're interested in, is how does the brain get us over the hump from the ontologically objective neurons with their secretions of neurotransmitters to subjective feeling. That's our question. And that's not a question that is a behavioristic question. That's a causal question. That's like, how do germs cause disease symptoms? It's a straightforward causal question. Now, the problem with the other stuff is, it seems to me that's some stuff added on extra, and it's quite useful. Yes, of course, normal human consciousness requires that you be brought up in a society and that you have, you never acquire language unless you're exposed to language. You have to have all of these social relations. All the same, there's gotta be a mechanism that does it. See, it's a bit like this. Suppose somebody said, well, you won't understand cars by looking at the damn inside of the engine. That's just oxidization of hydrocarbons. You gotta go out on the street and watch the society of cars, how they relate to each other, and how they get on with each other, and so on. Well, those are not mutually exclusive. You do both. Of course, you want to know how the child develops in a society and what are the social relations that produce certain forms of consciousness. My favorite is La Rochefoucauld, who said very few people would ever fall in love if they never read about it. And nowadays, if they never saw it on television or in the movies, they didn't have that in the 18th century France. And I think he's right, that falling in love is not something that just happens in your brain. You got to learn how to do it. You got to be and so on with all some kinds of other things. In order to want to become a philosophy professor or a saint or a Republican presidential candidate, you got to learn how to do it. You got to live in a society, and I agree. All of those are social phenomena. But say some more.
Well, do you think it's possible that in order to solve the problem of consciousness, that our whole understanding of the nature of matter will need to change?
Well, there is. I mean, here's an interesting issue right now for me. There is a rich tradition neurobiology now of investigating consciousness. And some of the best biologists alive are now working on exactly the problem that I've been talking about. And Francis Crick was one, Jerry Adelman is another one, and these are people who already got a Nobel Prize in one branch of science and want to go on and solve the problem of consciousness. So there is a whole lot of work going on. However, they tend to work within an existing paradigm, and maybe that paradigm is wrong. The paradigm says the functional unit is the neuron. Now, maybe you got to have a whole lot of neurons. Jerry says you got to have a whole maps of neurons, and other people say you got to have whole clouds of neurons and have special kind of mathematics. But the functional unit is the neuron. Now, there's another group of people who are regarded as nuts by the mainstream who say, no, it's a different kind of thing altogether. You got to do a quantum mechanical. You have to have a quantum mechanical approach. One thing that ought to worry these guys is none of the great neuroscientists take them seriously. You won't find them discussed in the standard textbooks in neurobiology, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. What worries me is this. The account that I have been urging is making very little progress. And the scientists are more impatient than philosophers. You know, we figure, well, on free will, give us another few hundred years. No scientist can think that way. You got to have research grants. And they're dismayed by the fact that they're making very little progress. So maybe it's the wrong paradigm. I don't know the answer to that. We do not know how the brain does it. However, there's something creepy about saying, well, it's quantum mechanical because you're substituting two mysteries for one. Consciousness is a mystery, quantum mechanics is a mystery. Put them together. I don't know that solves anything. So the short answer to your question is I don't know. I don't know what the right mechanism is. I think given our research techniques and given how much we've learned by studying brain processes, if I were doing this work myself, that's the way I would go. Yes, you're next.
So I think the main issue there is this problem of scale. You know, at what scale are we to look in order to understand how consciousness is brought forth? Are we to look at the social scale of the interaction between human beings and the world, or are we to look at the neural scale, the interaction of neural clouds in the brain, or are we to look at the subatomic quantum level, the interaction of electrons and all sorts of other strange wavical particle-like events? And my initial question about this neural-based approach to consciousness being just a subtler form of behaviorism is, I didn't fully articulate why I thought that. It's because when you look for a causal mechanism in terms of how neurons interact, you're still dealing with the way that exterior surfaces collide with one another, whether they're molecular surfaces or the membranes of neurons and the chemical messengers they're sending out. They're all physical, external objects. And when we're talking about consciousness, we're looking for interiority. We're looking for subjectivity, for feeling and sentience and emotion, and so on. And an account of how neurons interact is no different than an account of sort of input-output behaviorist type models that you saw when you teach a pigeon to peck a button. You're explaining something which has a different domain of significance, namely the subjective domain, in terms of an objective observable process. And so the neural approach just seems to me to be a more sophisticated behaviorism. And I don't think, maybe I didn't articulate the question well enough, but I don't think that that Searle really, took to heart what I was questioning there. So there's one more question that I asked that I'm queuing up here.
Need for a paradigm shift.
I'm going to try some red wine.
Yeah.
So I began asking the question, and John wanted some more wine.
I'd like the Sangiovese, if you don't mind, but anyway, whichever it was. Don't get me such a big thing. I know that I am, so I better not bring.
Prior to my question, panpsychism had
So
come up.
when I asked the question about maybe our understanding of the nature of matter needs to change, I wasn't really referring to Hammerhoff and Penrose or the quantum consciousness stuff. It was more panpsychism, or the more metaphysically robust and worked out versions of it, but like by someone we study very closely at CIIS, Alfred North Whitehead. And
Whitehead, a panpsychist.
Pan-experientialist is what it's been called.
Yeah, well, I'm convicted of a lot of stuff, but I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, he recognizes the importance of distinguishing between units, like organisms, let's say, and just aggregates of stuff. An organism is self-organizing, right? And so Whitehead wouldn't say that, the glass itself is conscious.
The glass is conscious?
He wouldn't say that the glass is conscious.
What is then?
Well, he would refer to experience as a lower grade form of consciousness.
What is having experiences?
Well, the atoms are self-organizing. They're self-organizing processes, not that much unlike organisms. Yeah. So he would say that is a unit which has some sort of experience as a unit.
Yeah.
But that aside, I'm wondering about you mentioned the Cartesian legacy, and this sort of peculiar history that we have as a culture. But more to point out the absurdity of the notion of an immortal soul. But there's another side to it.
I don't know. I'm sorry, it's absurd. I wish it were true.
Right.
But as far as I can tell, it's not true. And
Yeah.
I am stuck with the fact that I'm confronted with a philosophical tradition, which is deeply imbued
Right.
with the idea that you got to start with God, the soul, and immortality,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and that's really where the subject of consciousness comes in.
Right.
I'm sorry that we're not going to live immortal, but as far as I can tell, that's the bad news.
But there's the other side of that dualism,
Yeah.
the matter part, that I wanted to ask you about, because for Descartes, matter was just this insensate stuff that's just extension,
Yeah.
right? Pure extension. And I think, my feeling is that so long as we conceive of matter as just this mere extended stuff,
Yeah.
that it makes the question of how the brain produces consciousness, how matter produces consciousness, completely intractable.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, I don't think anybody in physics thinks of matter as extended stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The standard notion of an electron now is it's a point of mass energy. Well, that's one standard
Right.
notion. And if you think of quantum mechanics, the idea of how these are real little bits of Cartesian inert stuff.
Right. We're dealing with events, in other words, and not.
Well, whatever. But
Yeah.
I think that the crude Cartesian notion is long since abandoned.
Right.
But we have to be extremely careful when we're talking about these issues to remember the distinction between those things that are observer independent, they don't give a damn about us, and those that are only relative to our interests.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can say that the movement of the planets is completely observer independent. The planets don't give a damn about us. But when we say things like, the leaf is trying to turn toward the sun in order to get more sunlight, the leaf isn't trying to do anything. That's all observer relative. It's a perfectly natural way of talking. And biologists do talk about that. I have one passage that a kid sent me where the people writing in a journal of pharmacology say, the stomach is a very intelligent organ. It has to decide how to respond to these various inputs. And all that's metaphorical. It's all observer relative. The stomach is not busy thinking, why is this guy putting ethyl alcohol in me? Because it doesn't feed at all. It's just not a word about that kind of thing. So I think in the thing you said there, expressions like self-organizing, well, that implies some kind of purpose. And basically, bits of matter haven't got a purpose. They function the way they do, and it's perfectly all right to describe them in a purposive vocabulary. Mm-hmm. This object will try very hard to get to the center of the earth if I let go. But all that's metaphorical. It's observer relative. So the great gulf in the objective sciences is between, in the epistemically objective sciences, between those phenomena that are observer independent, and a lot of them are mental, like pains. Pains are observer independent, but there are lots of others that are observer relative. Language is observer relative. Something's a sentence only relative to the way that people treat it. Nothing is intrinsically a sentence. Mm-hmm. So I'm not optimistic for the prospects of panpsychism. Yeah.
How about some people who haven't?
So Yeah, John's not optimistic. This question of observer uh, relativity is interesting because earlier John was discussing leaves and the way that they will turn to face sunlight, and he says to assume that the leaf is doing that because it feels, the light and is sort of seeking it out as if it had a purpose intrinsic to itself. He thinks that that's misguided, that that's a projection of our own human sensibilities and sensitivities to a plant. Um, but I think if we're going to say that plants have no sentience and that they respond in a merely mechanical way to the stimulus of the sun, what's to stop us from saying that why wouldn't human beings be the same way? Why can't we respond to all the stimuli as complicated as the human world is? Why can't we do all of that without any awareness whatsoever? If the leaf can do it, why can't we? And this brings up Chalmers' zombie problem. Why is it that we should have an awareness of all of these bodily processes and sensations when the body could just as easily do the whole thing unconsciously? And I think that is a very deep question that John Searle kind of pushed to the side. But I think this reminds me of something Max Planck said, that when a science is in need of a paradigm shift in order to make any progress, it's not because the old guard is convinced of this need to shift paradigms. It's because the old guard retires and dies, and the younger generation that is fluent in the new, radically new ideas takes over. So I think that's how a pan-experientialist ontology will eventually, um, take up root within these scientific disciplines like neuroscience and begin clarifying a lot of the problems and paradoxes that a materialist ontology leaves us with. So, yeah, just thought I'd share that. Take it easy.